So anyway, today we're going to go through dignity. I've got my example chart here. I have to shorten this a little bit. Let's see how I can do that. But an important thing to consider is when we are talking about dignity, well, again, what is dignity for? We have to remember that dignity is based on what's called natural relationships. And I'm going to tie this all in from texts from Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra. I have numerous threads here from Parashara that we're going to read, and then we're going to apply it to a chart to work out dignities and how they work. But what is dignity doing? Well, remember I gave the example in the Rashis and Signs class that Venus has a particular quality, a particular energy to it. It's a type of person. You know, it has certain kinds of tastes. And so when you take Venus and you stick it in its own home in Taurus, well, it's in its own home. It can fulfill its agendas. It can fulfill its purposes because it's comfortable. It knows that even though its desk is a total mess, it knows exactly where the checkbook is when it's time to write out that bill. Because it's comfortable. It's in its own home, like a painter being in a painting studio. It's perfectly at home there. All right, but if we take Venus and we stick Venus in a sign that is not supportive of what it's all about, maybe we'll stick Venus here in Leo. Well, now it's required. Whereas Venus in Taurus, or Venus in general, Venus is the diplomat. Venus likes to see people get their fair share, things work out equally for everybody, because remember, Venus also rules over Libra. And pardon me, that's not Leo, that's Cancer, so let's stick it in Leo. So now we get Venus in Leo. So now we have this kind of planet that's interested in the fair share, fair treatment of everyone. It's into form and beauty, it's into luxury, it's into beautifying things. And we're sticking it in the sign of the sun. Now, there are certain qualities that Venus can benefit from the sun and vice versa, but now we're sticking it into the role of a king. And Venus doesn't necessarily work too well in that role, because in the role of a king, you have to make sacrifices. You have to sacrifice your luxuries. You have to sacrifice your sense of self for the greater good of your kingdom. Now, of course, in our current day and age, we have an idea of a king who's fat and, you know, lives off the wealth of others and really could care less about the people that he's serving. Well, that would be maybe like a Venus in Leo. All right, but Venus in Leo, Venus in the sign of the sun, is not necessarily going to be able to fulfill its agenda, because the qualities of the sign and the qualities of the planet are at cross purposes. And if you really think this through about the qualities of the planets and the qualities of the signs, that will give you deep insights into why planets work the way they do, where they are, which is related to this idea of dignity. Same thing. Dignity represents how a planet is going to act, which is why when you get a planet in good dignity, it's going to act very well in regards to its innate nature as being Venus. It's going to be able to take care of, generally speaking, the affairs of the house that Venus rules. You're going to have more success there. Whereas if you put a planet in bad dignity, and let's just take Mars, for example. Let's say we take Mars. And the great thing about Mars in general is that he only has one enemy. And who is that? But that's Mercury. So anytime we get Mars in Mercury's sign, we're going to get a frustrated energy of Mars. Remember, each planet has a particular role to play in your life. So there's not one better than the other. It's, are they in their appropriate place? That's really the key here. So we take Mars and we stick it in Gemini or Virgo. And what's the problem with that? Well, we have the act first, think later, get things done, take the initiative, Mars, in a very mental sign. So now we have this Mars that's sitting around thinking, well, is it a good idea for me to charge forward and take out this enemy? Or should I hang back and make a bigger plan? Or, well, I don't know, maybe let's think about this. Maybe I need to get some advice from someone else. Let me talk to my friends about it. And at the end of the day, Mars has no idea what to do. He's confounded, confused, and more than likely the the choice he's going to make is going to be the wrong one, because Mars is an instinctual planet. So it's meant to be, all right, what's the first gut reaction you're going to take? That's going to be where Mars excels. And Mars can't do that in the sign of Mercury. So that's why when people have Mars in a mercurial sign, they're going to have some issues with being able to make choices, take the initiative in a proper way. They might force the issue and succeed or fail, depending on their luck. Jupiter's going to play a big role in that. But by its innate nature, Mars in a mercurial sign is very similar, if we're going to use the analogy of a person, of taking a soldier and sticking it in a writer's den, someone who writes books, who has books everywhere, and typewriters and computers, and likes to sit and think and plan things out and whatnot. You take a warrior or a soldier and you're sticking them in this study, and you've got this aggressive person, which is Mars. And that person should be out in the field taking target practice, or getting stronger, or doing things of this nature. Being the general of an army, and you stick him behind a desk, and for a little while he might sit there and think, all right, well, this isn't so bad. But after a while, that Mars nature is going to come out, and what's he going to do? Well, he's going to look at these books, and he's not going to read them, and he's going to look at the typewriter, and he's not going to say, yeah, let's write a book. He's going to look at it, and he's going to say, let's line these up on the shelf over there, and I get 10 points if I can shoot that novel, and I get 100 points if I can shoot the keys off that typewriter one at a time. So he's going to have a good time shooting things up, but according to the Rashi that he's in, and the house that he's in, he's going to end up destroying it, which is why, for example, having Mars in bad dignity, he himself, remember, we're going to need to check his Ishta and Kashta to see just how potent this is going to be, which will be the source of another video. But he himself might have a blast shooting up this person's study. But the environment itself is going to be destroyed because we have an incompatible energy inhabiting this. And that's like Mars in Mercury sign, which generally speaking is going to make it in a worse dignity because Mars doesn't do well there. So always think about this, that when it comes to dignities, that's telling you the foundation of the planet itself. What does it rule over by its very nature? For Saturn, one's capacity to suffer, to do hard work, one's sorrows, one's capacity for detachment, for doing great deeds that take endurance and hard work again. All right, that's the natural quality of Saturn. You check his dignity, generally speaking, to see how's that going to manifest. And then you can also check to see what houses does Saturn rule over. If he's in bad dignity, well, those houses are also going to suffer. If he's in good dignity, those houses are going to thrive. Just like his natural indications, based on what he represents in the chart, will also thrive. That's why dignity is so important to understand. Number one, how are the Rashis going to express themselves? How are the houses going to be influenced, not only by the nature of the house lord that rules over it, but also by the planets that are in it. Using the same example of Mars here in Mercury's sign. Well, maybe Mercury is doing really well by dignity. So Mercury's trying his best to take care of his houses, but he's got this guy in here with a gun shooting up his study. So, and that's kind of how people's lives go, right? Sometimes you get a really wonderful person renting your apartment and you're a wonderful landlord. Sometimes you're a wonderful landlord and you get a really difficult person in your rental property. Sometimes you're a terrible landlord and then you get a wonderful person in your rental property. And it's all going to be reflected in the nature of dignity. All right. Now that we've considered this and reviewed this, let's crank through dignity. Now, according to Parashara, dignity is based on a few things. It's based on the positions of planets, from a planet's Mula Trikona sign. So the first thing we have to figure out, is what is the Mula Trikona sign of each planet. So we'll start there. The next thing we have to figure out, is what's called the natural relationships. And again, most people, what they've done is they just look at their software program where they get out the book, The Art and Science of Vedic Astrology, and they pull up page 50, let's see here, 52, somewhere around there. And they see that table and they say, oh, okay, these are the friends, neutrals, and enemies of each planet. But they don't, and they say to themselves, why? They never really take the time to actually figure it out, but they ask why. Now what we're going to do is we're going to answer that why for you. So this is based on natural relationships, meaning the planets of their very own accord, of their very own nature, how do they naturally influence one another when they are in the sign of another planet. All right, and there's a formula for this. I'm going to tell you what that formula is so that you don't have to just look at the chart. You can just remember the formula to figure it out. Beyond that, beyond the natural relationships, the next thing we have to look at is the temporary relationships, which again is another formula that tells us when Mercury is in the second house from Mars, what is their temporary friendship going to be like? It's a little bit beyond the natural relationship. And the way we get dignity is by compounding these, by looking at the natural relationship and then adding it together to the temporal relationship to see what the final result is. And that tells us what a planet's dignity is. And again, how does this make sense? How could you have a planet possibly be a temporary friend while being a natural enemy? Well, let's think about this kind of example. We know that Mercury and Mars, particularly Mercury's influence from Mars, is not a good one. But it's possible, like in this situation, we'll find out that when a planet is in the second house from the planet in question, it becomes a friend. But generally speaking, Mars doesn't really like being in Mercury's home, or he causes problems there. So how could this be a relationship that becomes an enemy naturally, but a friend in a temporal manner? Well, it's just like this. Mars is a soldier. Mars wants to go out and fight the good fight and protect people and support the Dharma. He doesn't have a whole lot to do with Mercury and his ideas of writing and taking notes and being a historian and all these sorts of things. But let's say we get this Mars, who's the general, who's out fighting the good fight. Well, and then we get Mercury, who's the note taker, or who's actually writing the history of this general's great accomplishments. So in that situation, this Mercury, the journalist, now is a friend towards Mars, because he's helping to support the agenda of Mars in a situational fashion. So the temporary relationships are situational, right? They're situational in the same way that you can have someone who's your total enemy, but in a certain situation, you become friends. Maybe you don't like your neighbor, but then someone moves in who's worse than your neighbor and you both want to get him out. So you become temporarily friends, okay? This is how we can think about this. Now, let's go ahead and go through the sutras, the text from Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra. So the first part deals with dignities, additional dignities, and that starts by telling us the Mula Trikona sign of each planet. And what is the Mula Trikona sign? It is the root trine for the planet, where the planet gets its energy, like the root of a plant supplies nutrients to the plant so that it can grow. This is very similar, we can think about it that way, with the Mula Trikona sign, the root trine. Mula, root, Trikona, trine. So let's put them in this chart here. So the first 20 degrees of Leo is the sun's Mula Trikona. So we'll take the sun and we'll put it in Leo. So the sun rules over Leo, and the first 20 degrees, 0 to 20 degrees of Leo, is the Mula Trikona sign of the sun. The rest of Leo is his own house. The first 3 degrees of Taurus is the moon's exaltation. So the first 3 degrees of Taurus is the moon's exaltation. The remaining degrees is the moon's mula trikona. So the moon's mula trikona is Taurus. And this answers that question when people say, oh, well, the moon is in Scorpio, therefore it's debilitated. And then I say, no, it's not. And they say, yes, it is. And I say, well, go look at what Parashara says. And what you'll find is the moon is debilitated in the first 3 degrees of Scorpio. The remaining degrees, actually, the moon will be in a natural neutral sign because it will be in Mars's sign. But anyway, we're working with the mula trikonas here. So the moon's mula trikona is Taurus. The first 12 degrees of Aries is the mula trikona of Mars. The first 12 degrees of Aries is the mula trikona of Mars, correct. The rest is his own house. So we put Mars in Aries, which will show us that the mula trikona of Mars is 0 to 12 degrees. The first 15 degrees of Virgo is his exaltation position for Mercury. The next 5 degrees are his mula trikona, and the remaining degrees are Mercury's own home. So, for the mula trikona of Mercury, that's Virgo, between 16 and 20 degrees. 16 and 20 degrees. Now, we continue on, and Parashara shows us that the first 10 degrees of Sagittarius is a mula trikona of Jupiter. That's Saturn, pardon me. So Sagittarius is mula trikona for Jupiter. The first 15 degrees of Libra is mula trikona for Venus. So putting Venus in Libra, that's the mula trikona of Venus. And next we move on to Saturn. The first 20 degrees of Aquarius is the mula trikona of Saturn. The first 20 degrees of Aquarius is the mula trikona of Saturn. Now, with this chart, we have all the planets situated in their mula trikona signs. They're the root trine for the planet, where it gets its nourishment, its capacity to do what it really wants to do. Now, this is important because the natural relationships of the planets, meaning when you look at those charts that say this planet is a natural friend to so-and-so, this planet is inimical to so-and-so, it's all based on the mula trikona, the root trine. So this is what Parashara says. The rulers of signs, which are the 4th, 2nd, 12th, 5th, 9th, and 8th, from the mula trikona of a planet are friends to that planet. Lords of signs other than these are its enemies. Although if the planet in question is exalted in any of these other signs, it is still friendly. When a planet is a friend as well as an enemy, based on this reckoning, then it is a neutral planet. The moon is said to have no enemies. For the moon, sun, and Mercury are friends, and the rest are neutral. Okay, now what does this tell us? This tells us that let me just write it out here, the 2nd, the 4th, 5th, 8th, 9th, and 12th. 2nd, 4th, 5th, 8th, 9th, and 12th from the mula trikona of a planet are friends. And then all the rest become enemies. And so we leave out the 1 because the 1 is its mula trikona sign. But let's go ahead and do that. So if we don't have a 1, then the next one is a 3, and then a 6, 7, 10, and 11. So these positions from the planet's mula trikona sign will be enemies. And what we're going to find, since this is why we're going through this in detail, what we're going to find is that it may be that a planet has sign rulership, which is going to make it both a friend and an enemy. And if that's the case, we take the average, which is neutral, which is why when it comes to natural friendships, they are either friendly, neutral, or enemies. Friendly, neutral, or enemies. All right, let's start with the sun. Now, this is one of those situations where I'm going to be juggling a lot of numbers and also counting a lot of houses. So it may be that I make a mistake or say the wrong number. Please pay attention. Usually I'm able to catch myself, but this is one of those situations where when you're teaching astrology, you're trying to juggle 3, 4, 5 sets of numbers at one time, and it may be that you mistakenly say something that's not true. But if you pay attention, you'll catch it, and then you'll never forget that. So sometimes making mistakes can be a helpful thing. But let's start with the sun. Now what we're looking for are the natural relationships. The natural relationships of the other planets to the sun. So the planet that rules the second house from the sun is Mercury, because this is the sun. The sun's mula trikona here. So the second house is ruled over by Mercury. That's Virgo. Now what we want to do is we want to check and see, does Mercury rule over any of these other houses that are good, or any of these other houses that are considered to be enemies? Well, he rules over the 11th from the sun's mula trikona. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. All right. Then that means that Mercury also rules a house that would make him an enemy, because he rules the 11th. Let's go ahead and make this a little more, let's see here, obvious for you. So this number here, those are going to be friends. This number here, those are going to be enemies. Oops. That's my fun font for my astrological symbols. Alright, so those are the friends, numbers for the friends. Remember, it's from the mula trikona sign, which is why I put the planets in their mula trikona signs in this chart to help you. These are the enemies. So we see that Mercury rules over number 2 from the sun. Mercury rules over number 11 from the sun, which makes him neutral. Which is why in that chart that shows what is the influence of Mercury to the sun from natural relationships, it's neutral, because it's a combination of the good and the enemy. Next we want to look at the moon. Alright, so the moon rules Cancer, which is the 12th sign from the sun's mula trikona. So the moon is considered friendly to the sun. He doesn't rule any other houses. Next we want to look at Mars. So Mars rules over 1, 2, 3, 4th from the sun's mula trikona. That makes him a friend. So there's number 4 under friends. Mars also rules the 7, 8, 9, the 9th from the sun's mula trikona, which again is a friendly sign from the planet's mula trikona. So therefore Mars is friendly to the sun. Next, we want to look at Mercury. Did we already do Mercury? Yeah, we already did Mercury. So let's go to Jupiter. So how's Jupiter situated? Well, Jupiter rules the 5th from the sun. So that falls here under the friends category. Jupiter rules the 8th from the sun, which is also in the friends category. So Jupiter is friendly towards the sun. Now, Venus, 1, 2, 3. Venus rules the 3rd from the sun's mula trikona. Enemies. You see that number 3 falls in the enemy situation. And we see that Venus rules 7, 8, 9, 10th from the sun's mula trikona. So enemies. So this is why Venus is considered to be an enemy to the sun. Alright, Saturn. Saturn rules the 6th and the 7th. The 6 and 7 falls under the enemy category. That's why Saturn, his natural situation, in regards to, is he friendly towards the sun or not? Makes him an enemy, a natural enemy. And this is how that chart is created. It's based on this formula from Parashara. Now let's continue on. The moon. So the moon's mula trikona is Taurus. Remember, it's all based on the mula trikona of the planet in question. So the sun rules 1, 2, 3, the fourth from the moon's mula trikona. Therefore, the sun is a friend to the moon. Mercury rules the second and fifth. Pardon me. So Mercury rules the second and the fifth. That makes Mercury a friend to the moon, because we see the 2 and 5 are both in the friends category. Mars. Mars rules the 7th and the 12th from the moon's mula trikona. Well, the 12th makes it a friend, the 7th makes it an enemy. So therefore Mars is neutral through natural friendship to the moon. Jupiter rules the 8th, and Jupiter rules the 11th. So that's going to make Jupiter neutral, because the 8th makes it a friend, the 11th makes it an enemy. Venus rules the sign the planet's in, so I guess we could use a 1 there. Rules the sign that it's in, and it also rules the 6th from the moon's mula trikona. So we have 6, and we have to be aware as well. Remember, in the additional dignities it says that if the planet in question is exalted in any of these other signs, it is still friendly. So we have the moon in an exaltation position, because the moon not only is mula trikona in Taurus, but it's also exaltation. So therefore we have 6th for enemy, but also the exaltation position, which is going to make it a friend, which is why Venus is neutral to the moon. Saturn. Saturn rules the 7th, 8th, 9th from the moon, and the 10th from the moon. So here we have 9, friend, 10, enemies. So what's that make Saturn? That makes Saturn neutral. And in this case, we already know that the moon has no enemies. And it can be worked out. It can be worked out based on this numerical formula from Parashara. Alright, we're continuing on because I really want you to understand how this works. We're going to go through them all. And if you went through them all and created a chart from this, you would get that chart that's in the Art and Science of Vedic Astrology that spells it out for you. Okay, so let's see. Talked about the moon. Let's move on to Mars. Mars. Let's look at the sun in relationship to Mars. So the sun rules 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th from Mars's mula trikona. That makes him a friend. The moon rules the 4th from Mars's mula trikona. Number 4 makes him a friend. Jupiter rules the 9th and the 12th from the mula trikona. 9 and 12. That makes Jupiter a friend to Mars. Venus and Saturn now. Let's start with Venus. Venus rules the 2nd. Venus rules the 7th. 2 is friends, 7 is enemies, so therefore Venus is naturally neutral to Mars. Saturn rules the 9th and the 10th. 9th is friend, 10 is enemy. So Saturn is actually naturally neutral to Mars. Mercury rules the 3rd and the 6th. Both 3 and 6 make Mercury the enemy to Mars. Now, when we get into the Grahas and Planets course coming up in September, we'll get more into some of the logic behind why these planets, aside from this formula, but the actual personality-based logic of why these planets, for example, Mars, we're going to find out is an enemy to Saturn, but Saturn is neutral to Mars. Why is that the case? Well, again, if you think about human relationships, human dynamics, and how each of these planets represents a kind of being or person, you'll see that. But we'll get into that when we get into the fall Planets and Grahas course. For now, we just have to get this information, this puzzle piece in our head, so we know what to do with future information. All right, so we looked at Saturn, we looked at Mercury. Great. So Mercury. So from Mercury's Mula Trikona, the Sun rules the 12th. Therefore, the Sun is a friend to Mercury. Venus rules the 2nd and the 9th. 2 and 9 makes Venus a friend to Mercury. Mars rules the 3rd and the 8th. So 3 and 8, a friend and an enemy. That makes Mars a neutral to Mercury. Jupiter rules the 3rd and the 7th. Pardon me, did I get that right? Jupiter rules, the 4th and the 7th. So friend 4, enemy 7. Jupiter rules the 4th and the 7th from Mercury's Mula Trikona, which is what makes Jupiter a natural neutral. Saturn rules the 5th, and Saturn rules the 6th. 5th is friend, 6th is enemy. Therefore, Saturn is a natural neutral to Mercury. The moon rules the 11th from Mercury. The 11th from Mercury. And that makes the moon an enemy to Mercury. Jupiter. So Jupiter's Mula Trikona is Sagittarius. The Sun rules the 9th from Jupiter. Therefore, the Sun is a friend to Jupiter. The moon rules the 8th from Jupiter. Therefore, the moon is a friend to Jupiter. Mars rules the 5th and the 12th from Jupiter. 5 and 12 makes it a friend. Saturn rules the 2nd and the 3rd. 2 friend, 3 enemy. So therefore Saturn is neutral to Jupiter. Mercury and Venus. Mercury rules the 7th and the 10th. 7 and 10 makes Mercury an enemy to Jupiter. Venus rules the 6th and the 11th. 6 and 11 makes Venus an enemy to Jupiter. And what you're going to find is that if you pay attention to these numbers, 2, 4, 5, 8, 9, 12, that, again, thinking them through, 3, 6, 7, 10, and 11, that you're going to find that these positions, 2nd, 4th, 5th, 8th, and 9th, and 12th, even though the 8th and 12th can be considered sometimes troubling, they're actually can be supportive of a particular planet in regards to the things that it rules over. Whereas 3, 6, 7, 10, and 11 can sometimes get in the way of a planet's capacity to fulfill its innate nature. So you're going to find the more you study astrology and the more you pay attention to all these little tidbits of information, how things are put together, you're going to see numbers repeated for good or for ill or for neutral situations. And that's going to help you unlock how astrology works. It's not just about memorizing these things. It's about seeing the deeper patterns, not just in the chart, but also in regards to how the principles are put together. And they are put together in a logical fashion if you take enough time to see the bigger perspective, the bigger puzzle, the broader scheme of things. And that requires that you understand how each principle that you use works. Then it will make logical sense. Otherwise, you're just hoping that it makes sense. And then you're going to question it when it actually does make sense, because you don't have all the pieces for how they should fit. So hopefully you understand what I'm saying here. Anyway, where were we? Jupiter. All right, so Venus. All right, so from Venus's Mula Trikona, which is Libra. Mercury. Mercury rules the 9th and the 12th. 9 and 12, friends. Therefore, Mercury is a natural friend to Venus. Saturn rules the 4th and the 5th. 4 and 5. Saturn becomes a natural friend to Venus. Jupiter rules the 3rd and the 6th. 3 and 6th. Let's see. So Jupiter rules the 3 and the 6. So if we're looking at Jupiter from Venus, what we're seeing is that we've got Jupiter rules the 3rd and the 6th from Venus, which should make Jupiter an enemy to Venus. Alright, now this is where it gets a little tricky, because just like the moon has no enemies, Jupiter is not an enemy to anybody. Jupiter is not an enemy to anybody. Now how do we work this out? Well, once again, we refer back to the idea in the natural relationships that says, although if the planet in question is exalted in any of these other signs, it is still friendly. So even though we see that Jupiter rules the 3rd and the 6th, which makes it an enemy, well, the 6th, where Venus is exalted, that makes it friendly. So here we get that rule where it's like an exception, and it's an exception to the rule. But it makes sense because we see that an exalted planet typically does very well. So in this situation, Jupiter, he does rule the 3rd and the 6th, which would make him enemies from Venus's Mula Trikona. However, since Venus is exalted in the 6th sign that Jupiter rules over, that makes him friendly. And so Jupiter, therefore, becomes neutral, which helps us to fulfill that principle that, number one, the moon has no enemies, and number two, or I should say, the moon has no enemies, and that Jupiter is an enemy to no one. Right? Jupiter is supportive of everyone. And Jupiter supports any planet that it's with, delights any planet that it's with, in the same way that the moon can adapt to any planet that it's with. All right, so that's sort of the larger theory behind this. But if we follow Parashara's description in the natural relationships, we see how this works out, even though if we did not read that part that says if the planet in question is exalted in any of these signs, it is still friendly, we might have said to ourselves, oh, well, Jupiter should be an enemy to Venus. And we would have a valid reason, but as with all things, not all things, but many things, there may be an additional corollary, something else that you have to pay attention to get the actual information. Now Mars rules over the 7th and the 2nd from Venus's Mula Trikona, so friend to 7 enemies. That's why Mars is neutral to Venus. The Sun and the Moon. The Moon rules over the 10th from the Mula Trikona, enemy. The Sun rules over the 11th. That makes the Sun an enemy as well. And finally, Saturn. Saturn's Mula Trikona is Aquarius. Mercury rules over the 5th and the 8th. 5 and 8, Mercury is a friend to Saturn. Venus rules over the 4th and the 9th. 4 and 9, Venus is a friend to Saturn. Jupiter rules over the 2nd and the 11th. 2, 11. So Jupiter is neutral to Saturn. The Sun rules over the 7th, making him an enemy. Moon rules over the 6th, making him an enemy to Saturn. Mars rules over the 3rd and the 10th, 3 and 6. Therefore, Mars is an enemy to Saturn. Now, we've just gone through the entire natural friendships table that are in a lot of astrology books. The one I use is the one that Richard Fish and I put together, The Art and Science of Vedic Astrology, Volume 1. But as we see, it's based on Parashara's statements that say, the rulers of signs, which are 4th, 2nd, 12th, 5th, 9th, and 8th from the Mula Trikona of a planet, are friends to that planet. Lords of signs other than these are its enemies. Although if the planet in question is exalted in any of these other signs, it is still friendly. When a planet is a friend as well as an enemy based on this reckoning, then it is a neutral planet. The moon is said to have no enemies. For the moon, the Sun and Mercury are friends and the rest are neutral. And now that we know this, we can have a very good idea of how a planet's going to naturally function in a given sign. Is it in a sign that's supportive of its innate nature, of its own agenda? So that's not dignity, that's just natural friendships, which helps you understand a lot about how planets work in a person's chart. The next thing we have to consider is temporary relationships, and then how those lead to the compound relationships, which is what dignity is all about. We've talked about the dignities, we've talked about the natural relationships. The next thing we need to move on to is the temporary relationships, get an understanding of the temporary relationships. Now let's review the dignities once more. Let's review the dignities once more. We have, starting at Aries. Let's see, is that the best way to approach it? Let's double check here. Okay. We'll start with planets themselves instead of the signs. So let's start with the Sun. The Sun's exaltation degree, highest exaltation degree, is 10 degrees of Aries. The Sun's debilitations degree, the highest degree of debilitation, or deepest degree of debilitation, I should say, is 10 degrees of Libra. Exaltation of the Moon, 3 degrees of Taurus. The fall of the Moon, 3 degrees of Scorpio. Exaltation of Mercury, 15 degrees of Virgo. Debilitation, 15 degrees of Pisces. Venus' most profound exaltation is 27 degrees of Pisces. Deepest debilitation is 27 degrees of Virgo. Mars is exalted at 28 degrees Capricorn, debilitated at 28 degrees Cancer. Jupiter is exalted at 5 degrees Cancer, debilitated at 5 degrees Capricorn. Saturn's exaltation sign, 20 degrees Libra, and deep debilitation is 20 degrees Aries. Now, we've already discussed ownership with the Rashi's classes. Saturn owns Capricorn and Aquarius. Jupiter owns Pisces and Sagittarius. So Saturn, Capricorn and Aquarius, Jupiter, Sagittarius and Pisces. Mars owns Aries and Scorpio. Venus owns Libra and Taurus. Mercury owns Gemini and Virgo. The Moon rules or owns Cancer. Sun rules or owns Leo. Now, the Mula Triconas. It's important to memorize these. It's important to get them in your head. Remember that these come specifically from Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra. So we have the Sun's Mula Trikona falling in 0 to 20 degrees Leo. The Moon's Mula Trikona is in Taurus, and it's 3 degrees, and then the rest of Taurus is the Moon's Mula Trikona. So the first 3 degrees of Taurus is the Moon's exaltation. The rest of Taurus is the Moon's Mula Trikona. Mercury, Mula Trikona, is 16 to 20 degrees of Virgo. Venus's Mula Trikona is 0 to 20 degrees of Libra. Mars's Mula Trikona is 0 to 12 degrees Aries. Jupiter's Mula Trikona is 0 to 5 degrees Sagittarius. And Saturn's Mula Trikona is 0 to 20 degrees Aquarius. So 0 to 20 degrees Aquarius is Saturn's Mula Trikona. 0 to 5 degrees Sagittarius is Jupiter's Mula Trikona. 0 to 12 degrees Aries is Mars's Mula Trikona. 0 to 20 degrees Libra is Venus's Mula Trikona. 16 to 20 degrees Virgo is Mercury's Mula Trikona. From 3 degrees onward in Taurus is the Moon's Mula Trikona. And 0 to 20 degrees of Leo is the Sun's Mula Trikona. Remember, the Mula Trikona means root trine. And there is a theory, a principle put forth that, if you're looking at a chart, and if we're looking at a Libra ascendant like in this chart, and you want to know, well, which house is going to be more prominent of Saturn's houses that he owns, they often say look to the Mula Trikona sign. So if the Mula Trikona sign for Libra, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's the 5th Rashi, well, then that makes Saturn typically more auspicious because his Mula Trikona is the 5th sign. For example, for a Virgo ascendant, the Mula Trikona for Saturn is Aquarius, which is the 6th Rashi from Virgo. So even though Saturn does rule a trine from Virgo, since the Mula Trikona is Aquarius, he's going to lean a little bit more towards the harsher side for Virgo, because it's the Mula Trikona that's supposed to be that root energy and the most important sign related to the signs that a planet particularly rules over. Now, we've talked about natural relationships. We've mentioned how that's going to show you, is a planet in a sign in which its agenda can be naturally supported. And the dignity is going to build upon that. But the temporary relationships, this shows us how a planet works with another planet on a situational basis. We've already given that example or thought process around that. So it's a situational basis. And you'll find that in relationships with people, relationships with things. Sometimes the situation makes things work together. And this is actually something that's going to be more important when we start looking at planets by themselves, not as ruling over houses and so on, but by themselves. Because just like what most people do is they take the natural relationships and they say, well, the natural relationships are only one part of the equation to get dignity, because you have to add the natural relationships to the temporary relationships. And then they say, and the temporary relationships are just 50% of the equation to get dignity, right? Because you have to add the natural and temporary together. But what they fail to realize is that the natural relationship has its own role to play. And the temporary relationship also has its own role to play. And this comes out when you start reading things like Sarvarta Chintamani or getting involved in Prajna astrology. But a planet, based on the things that it rules, can get help from another planet, even if it's a temporary friend, despite the fact that it might be a natural enemy. So these do add up to dignity, but they can play their own role separately, in the same way that when we look at Shadbala. In Shadbala, we've got Stanabala, Digbala, Kalabala, Ayanabala, Cheshtabala, Drigbala, Naisargikabala, whether it's in planetary war or not. Well, all of these things add up to that final thing, which we mostly call Shadbala. But each of them in particular also, anyway, sorry about that interruption. Usually I turn my phone off, but I forgot that time. But anyway, for example, with Shadbala, we have all these strings, and they add up to, most certainly, that final total that most people use when it comes to assessing Shadbala, this kind of graph that we see here. But each of those strengths by themselves also gives us information. So we're starting to see how detailed astrology is, not only just in regards to the formulas that give us kind of like a final general assessment, but that we can actually break down the formula, because certain aspects of the formula will tell us more about the planet, the situation, the house, and so on. But again, we'll get more into Shadbala when we start talking about the Grahas and Planets class coming up in September for the apprenticeship program. And we'll also get into how to use the temporary relationships as well by themselves, because this is extremely important. But anyway, let's go ahead and get back here to figuring out dignity. So this is our last chart. Let me get rid of some of this, because it's going to change a bit for us. So what's the principles of temporary relationships from Parashara? Well, let's see if I can get my numbers here again. Well, Parashara says for temporary relationships, the planets in the 10th, 4th, 11th, 3rd, 2nd, or 12th from a planet become friends. The rest are its enemies. So let's write this down. Let's see, get my tool back up here. So for friends, when it comes to temporary relationships, 10, 4, 11, 3, 2, 12. 10, 4, 11, 3, 2, 12. For enemies, it's the rest. So the things that are not in 10, 4, 11, 3, 2, and 12, which are going to be what? Well, we're going to have 1, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and that's it. Now, these are temporary relationships. What does that mean? That means if we have Mercury here, down in Virgo, and we've got Venus in the second sign from Virgo, well, since Venus is in the second from Mercury, he's going to be in a temporary friend sign. The Sun is in the 12th from Mercury, so he's also in a temporary friend sign. Jupiter's in the 4th from Mercury. He's in a temporary friend sign. The Moon is in the 9th from Mercury. He's in a temporary enemy sign. Mars is in the 8th from Mercury, so he's in a temporary enemy sign. And Saturn is in the 6th from Mercury, so he's also in a temporary enemy sign. Now, that means that planets that essentially fall on this axis, actually let me clear that, fall on this axis are going to be friends of Mercury. And if we look here, it's 10, 4, 11, 3, 2, and 12. So this is one of the reasons why I particularly like this kind of chart, because it's very easy to see temporary friends. They're all going to be around the 3 rashis around the planet in question. Now what are the enemies? Well, it's the opposite, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and the same house that the planet's in. So if we would have had, say, the Moon with Mercury here, it would have been in a temporary enemy sign too. And why is that? Well, that takes us back to that whole idea when you might have read, it says, having more than 3 or more than 4 planets in a sign destroys that sign. Well, what's the rationale, the logic behind that? It's because when you get planets in the same sign, they're going to be temporary enemies to each other. And why is that? Because their agendas are going to be competing. Mercury wants to do something. The Moon wants to do something. Venus wants to do something. They want to do different things, generally speaking. And when you have those different agendas, that sign doesn't get a chance to develop itself. So when it comes to temporary friends, you can follow and memorize this: 10, 4, 11, 3, 2, 12. Enemies 1, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Or you can just have the picture pattern in your head, where it's going to be the 3 rashis on both sides of the house in which the planet is placed. Those are going to be its friends. Its enemies are all the rest of them. Its enemies are all the rest of them. And another way of thinking about this is when a planet is 12, 11, 10, 2, 3, 4, that it's still close enough to be of benefit to this planet in question. And when it's in the same sign, well, we have competing agendas. And when it's in 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 from it, it's too far away. So again, we have some difficulty getting harmony between the planets, the one in question and then the position from the planet in question. So let's try this again, just for fun. All right, so Mars. Moon is in the 2nd from Mars, so it's a temporary friend. Sun, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, is in the 5th from Mars, therefore it's a temporary enemy. Mercury, 6th from Mars, temporary enemy. Venus, 7th from Mars, temporary enemy. Jupiter, 9th from Mars, temporary enemy. Saturn, 11th from Mars, temporary friend. Now this is just a temporary relationship. And again, why would this be useful to just know the temporary relationship? Well, there are certain techniques or principles that say things like, if Saturn happens to rule over your mother, if Saturn happens to rule over your mother, and let's say the ascendant is, we'll say the ascendant is Gemini here. So if Saturn rules your mother, and you are represented by the ascendant, so Mercury is the Lord, then what they say is figure out the temporary friendship between Saturn and Mercury. And it might be due to Jaimini Karakas, things of this nature. Because if we have Saturn representing the Karaka for mother, well then, if we have Mercury and Saturn in temporary enemy relationships, then that's going to stress the relationship between the mother and the person. Okay, even though by their natural friendships, we're going to find that Mercury is a friend to Saturn, and that Saturn is neutral to Mercury. So, this will make a lot more sense when we start looking at charts in that way in regards to the planets. So again, the grahas and planets course. But I just wanted you to know that this is why temporary enemies, temporary friends are so important. And again, from this Mars, well, if a planet was in the same sign as Mars, number one, it would be a temporary enemy. So any planets in 2, 3, 4, any planets in 12, 11, 10 are going to be temporary friends to Mars. Any planets in the same sign, any planets in 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 are going to be temporary enemies. Now, how does this function in relationship to dignity? That's what we have to find now. So let's pull up an example. Let's clear off all of our notes here. Let's look at these planets. Let's find the dignity of these planets based on the principles of combining natural relationships with temporary relationships. First of all, when it comes to dignity, if a planet is in its own home, meaning it rules that sign, or if it's exalted, or if it's mula trikona, you don't have to do this combination. It's just own home, exalted, mula trikona. And a lot of people's computer software will have like DB for debilitation. That's also something that's just flat out debilitate. You don't have to combine anything there. This chart doesn't have own home or exalted, so we can't use it. But OH is own home, EX is exalted, MT is mula trikona, generally speaking. So here we've got Saturn. Saturn is in Mercury's sign. Mercury is a friend to Saturn. That's the natural relationship. We worked that out earlier. We see that Mercury is in the second house from Saturn, which also makes it a temporary friend. So therefore, Saturn should be in a great friend sign. Let's see. So here's Saturn. There's the dignity, GF, great friend. So how did we get that? Well, we looked at the natural relationship of Saturn's position, and we combined it with the temporary relationship of the lord of the planet from Saturn. So friend plus friend equals great friend. In the same way that enemy plus enemy equals great enemy, friend plus enemy equals neutral, and so on. Now, Saturn and the Sun. Well, I'm not going to go through all of these because this can take us a little while. But if we want to consider the natural relationship, well, we already know that Saturn is in a friend sign. But now we want to know, how is Saturn going to function in relationship to the Sun? How are these two planets going to function in relationship to each other? Well, Saturn we know is a natural enemy to the Sun, and the Sun is a natural enemy to Saturn. So these guys are going to act like great enemies towards each other. Let's see. Now there's a chart that shows this. Aspects planetary. So planetary relationships. There we are. So we find the Sun. We go down and we find Saturn. We see it says GE, great enemy. Hopefully this is coming through on the screen. So when we're using temporary relationships, remember, it's not just about dignity. We also want to figure out how are these planets functioning in a relationship to each other by being in the same sign. In the same way, Sun to Venus. Well, we know Sun is an enemy to Venus, and Venus is an enemy to the Sun. So we go to the Sun here, we go down to Venus, and we see great enemy again. So we know that the combination of Sun and Venus in this particular sign, that they're going to conflict. They're going to kind of short circuit each other's agendas. Which again, this is all going to be very much based on how Lajatati Avashtas work and so on. But this is where temporary relationships becomes very important. This is not dignity. This is just the temporary relationships of planets in the same sign. Now again, let's look at planets in the sign, because it's the sign the planet's in that gives us the dignity. So the Sun. The Sun is in a natural neutrals sign, because Mercury is neutral to the Sun. Yet Mercury is in the second house from the Sun, which makes it a temporary friend. So therefore, neutral plus friend will give us a great friend. Oh, pardon me, that's the planetary relationship. Let's move back here. So just to go up and over, a friend, that's right. So we have a neutral plus friend equals friend. In the same way that neutral plus enemy equals enemy. And again, you can review this. On page 54 of the Art and Science of Vedic Astrology, Volume 1, it describes friend plus friend equals great friend. Neutral plus friend equals friend. Friend plus enemy equals neutral. Neutral plus enemy equals enemy. Enemy plus enemy equals great enemy. And this is how we're getting our dignity, by seeing what sign is the planet in. Let's look at Mars. Well, Mars is just debilitated, so we don't have to go through this process. So Mars should show up DB, correct. Let's look at Mercury. So Mercury is in the sign of the Moon. We know the Moon is an enemy to Mercury because we already worked that out as natural relationships. But we see that the Moon is in the third sign from Mercury. So we see that that's going to make the Moon a temporary friend. So if we have enemy plus friend, that will give us neutral. So here's Mercury. Scroll over. Sure enough, there's the letter N for neutral. But now let's consider this. Mars and Mercury are together. Well, we know that Mercury is an enemy to Mars. Mercury is an enemy to Mars. And we know that by temporary relationships, that being in the same sign, sign 1, makes him a temporary enemy as well. So this Mercury is a great enemy to Mars. So we find Mercury, we scroll down, we see GE here. Now I've got Mars, which is neutral to Mercury. Mars is neutral to Mercury. But from the temporary relationships, it's in the same sign, sign 1, that's what that means. That's going to make him an enemy. So we have neutral plus enemy, which creates what? But an enemy. We go to Mars, we scroll down to Mercury, there's an E for enemy. So as we can see, yes, the temporary relationships help us determine dignity, but the temporary relationships by themselves are going to show us how planets are going to work together. Not by dignity, just by how are their agendas going to mesh due to the situation that the planet plays in this person's life. Let's do one more here just to find dignity. So here we have the Moon. The Moon is in Mercury's sign. The Moon is in Mercury's sign. We know that Mercury is a friend to the Moon. Mercury is a friend to the Moon through natural relationships. We then need to find where is Mercury from the Moon. This is to calculate dignity. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So Mercury's in the 11th from the Moon. The 11th from the Moon should make it a friend. So we have a friend plus friend, which is going to put the Moon in a great friend's dignity. So here's the Moon. Let's see if that's true. Great friend, sure enough. Which means that the fact that the Moon rules over this person's 10th Rashi, their 9th cusp, and it goes into the 12th house. that this moon, generally speaking, is going to be able to fulfill in a very happy, satisfied way, mostly, its agenda and its role. It's not going to be something that's going to be as stressful for the individual, since this is a benefic planet. And this is where dignity plays such a crucial role in interpreting a chart correctly. It's the foundation for all these other techniques, for figuring out the avashtas, everything. So this is how Parashara describes the natural relationships, the temporary relationships, and the compound relationships. And let me read a few more threads of Parashara, since this is part of the apprenticeship course. So for compound relationships, he says, when two planets are naturally friendly, they become great friends. A planet which is friendly combined with a neutral planet creates friends. Enmity on one account and friendliness on the other creates a neutral relationship. An enemy planet combined with a neutral creates an enemy relationship. When both planets are enemies, this creates a relationship for great enemies. Then it goes on to say, the astrologer can use this understanding to declare the nature of the horoscope. This creates the five-fold relationship we consider to be planetary dignity. Now, ratio of effects of dignity. So now he's telling us how good or how difficult are these dignities going to help the planet express its agenda. Ratio of dignity. So shloka 59 through 60. An exalted planet gives fully good effects. Meaning that planet can fulfill its agenda perfectly. Now again, it has to be qualified by avashtas, shabala, and so on, but just by its innate nature, based on the qualities of the planet and the houses that it rules, when it's exalted, it can give fully good effects in relationship to how that planet functions. When in Mula Trikona, we subtract a quarter of its effects. So in Mula Trikona, it loses a quarter of its good effects, but we still have 3/4 good effects. A planet in its own home has half of its beneficial prospects. So therefore, when a planet's in its own home, it's still got 50% good. Its beneficial prospect is a quarter in a friendly sign. In a neutral sign, the effect is 1/8 good. The good effects are nil in an enemy or debilitation sign, and the inauspicious effects are reversed based on the previous statements. What does that mean? Well, it's like this. Mula Trikona, if you subtract a quarter, which means that 75% of it is good, well, 25% of it is bad. In the same way that in a neutral sign, the effect of good is 1/8, which means the rest of it is negative. Now, this has to be tied in to some other calculations, some other principles, which we will get to as we proceed through our examples and through this apprenticeship program. But for now, what you're getting a sense of is the karma represented by these planets related to dignity. Is the karma going to be primarily good or bad? And you can see it drops off pretty quickly. So this is why you need to also understand things like the Lajatati avashtas to see, well, a planet can be debilitated, but it could also be getting help from its friends, in the same way that you could have a terrible life, but you're taken care of by the people around you. Or you can have everything that you ever wanted, being maybe you're an exalted planet, but you've got so many enemies hitting you with the Lajatati avashtas that you're always in debt, you're always going to court, you're always getting beat up. But other than that, you have all this promise. So again, this is the beginning foundation of understanding how you read the chart, but you have to know how these things work. That way, when we get into more complex equations of astrology, you'll be like, okay, now I understand this part, let's put it together with this, and here's the result that we can use to interpret the chart. Okay, so we'll go ahead and conclude here in relationship to the description of the natural relationships, the temporary relationships, and the compound relationships.